Okay, here's what I'm thinking like for Unit 3, like when we start off in the very beginning where we got into Unit 3, and that was the difference between accounting and economic profit, right? And remember a few things. So first off, when we talk about let me make sure it's in there. Okay, so when we talk about accounting profit, remember that it is always larger than economic profit. If ever you have some bias in there of like, I don't think that they would be considering, the wages, the wages that they're missing out on, you got to let that go. Okay. And so with the accounting profit, we're looking here at where we're looking at total revenue minus total cost, but our total costs are just the explicit costs. Whereas when we look at economic profit, when we're talking about economic profit, this is where we're looking at total revenue minus total costs, and we're looking at the explicit costs and the implicit costs, right? So those are our two. So then it becomes this thing of, okay, what are explicit costs? We're dealing here with our factors of production. Remember, our factors of production are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur ability. And so the explicit costs are the land, which would be the rent that people have to pay, the labor, which would be the wages that they have to pay. They also, you would have the capital, which would be any of the materials, goods that are used to make a final product. All of that makes up the explicit costs. It's the implicit costs that are really about the entrepreneur. And the number one that they always refer to are the wages that they could have earned if they weren't doing this job and being or running their own business. Those foregone wages, right? It's that opportunity cost of choosing to be an entrepreneur. And so that is why the accounting profit will always be greater than the economic profit, because you will have these implicit costs that will be a part of it that weren't in the accounting one. Those are the types of questions that they ask. They might ask you to calculate it, and that's where you're just not including the foregone wages for the accounting profit. I have seen it like on a multiple choice before, where they did ask, they showed an example of an implicit cost about like the entrepreneur who had money in the bank, and because they're using it for the business and spending it and like taking out a loan, the interest that they've paid is foregone money that they could have had. And so that was an implicit cost. But that was just one time, like on a multiple choice. It's usually about the foregone wages. Whenever you are looking at a graph that we have, we're always talking about economic profit. We're looking at explicit and implicit costs. I remember it was like when we were doing Monopolistic Competition or something like that, and they had a scenario where it was pretty straightforward, I felt like, and they had it where the marginal cost was equaling the average total cost, and they made it really easy, right? And this was the demand and the marginal revenue. And they said that they were producing at the break-even point. No, I think maybe they said they were producing at productive efficiency, which was also their break-even point. And it asked then, what was the accounting profit? And that's where you were supposed to say that it was higher because they weren't taking into account their implicit costs. And a lot of people got it wrong, and they said 0 because that's what you saw here. But this is an economic profit graph, not the accounting profit. Please stop me or just chime in if there's ever any questions that you have as I'm going through, okay? So that's the first thing that I think about with the costs. But the thing that I think like for sure some of you are going to see on the AP exam is the difference between like a lump sum and a per unit tax and how that shifts the cost curves. So when we're looking at it here, first off, we need to remember or think about, well, what is the difference between a per unit and a lump sum? So let's take, for example, a perfectly competitive firm. So sad, you guys don't have to draw them this year, but there's my demand and supply, and there's my market graph, right? And then this here is my firm, which is kind of cut off, so we'll do the quantity here. And this, I'm just using that dollars per unit when I'm doing that. Okay. So with this one here, remember that a perfectly competitive firm, that they are a price taker. And so they will take the price from the market, and that gives us that PF. Over here, we have our friend of Mr. DARP, right? And then this is where you have the MR equals MC. So let's talk first off, since we're doing cost curves, the marginal cost curve. Why is the marginal cost curve upward sloping? Rahel, can you answer that one?
Diminishing returns.
Beautiful. And like, that's what I think about with unit 3. Like if I'm like in a, I don't know what to say. If they're asking me stuff about like cost curves or things like that, start gravitating towards diminishing returns. And so when I'm looking at this marginal cost curves are U-shaped because at first you have the increasing returns. And what that means is that with all of the resources held constant, except one variable input, because this is a short run graph. And so I can only change one variable input in the short run. My output increases at an increasing rate. And so that's the additional costs, are going down. But that doesn't last for very long, and no decision making happens there. And so this is where you have the diminishing returns, where with all of the resources held constant, except for one variable input, output increases at a decreasing rate. Marginal cost is positive, or marginal cost is rising. Those are answers that they'll accept when talking about diminishing returns, okay? And so there's my marginal cost curve, that's upward sloping. Then I could ask you though, okay, sticking with diminishing returns real quick, where does diminishing returns set in? And so you might have a chart here, and this would be the quantity of workers. And so again, I'm looking at I'm looking at output increasing at a decreasing rate. So maybe I just have here, I can fit in 3 workers. So I've got my 3 workers here. The first worker isn't, has a total product of 0. Then I have the first worker, and maybe they have 10 that they're adding. The next one is going to be at 40. And then I have here 50 that I have for the third worker. If I'm looking here at where diminishing returns sets in, I have to look at my marginal product, that marginal output. And so where this is at 10, because I'm looking at the change in total product. If these were increments in 2, my marginal product would have to be divided by 2. So just make sure that these are in increments of 1. Then I have it here at 30, and then I have this one here at 10. Okay, so first off, I've got 2 10s here, right? And so sometimes people will gravitate towards that first one. But diminishing returns sets in with the addition of the third worker, because that third worker, the output increases by 10. So that's a decreasing rate from the previous worker. And it's only going to get lower and lower after that. Like if I were to look at what the marginal product will look like for the next one, it's probably going to be 5 and then 0 maybe, and then a -5. And that's where you have negative returns. And so that's where we see the upward sloping part here. If the price of the good is selling for $10, this is where you would then want to look at where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. So if I were to shift this now, this is where I want my marginal revenue to equal my marginal cost, right? And that is going to give me my profit maximizing output. And that's how I can determine that, okay? So now we get into the cost curves and looking at things. let's say here that this firm is in long-run equilibrium. Well, if it's in long-run equilibrium, that means then that my ATC curve at that profit maximizing quantity, it has to be at its minimum. So then there's a great question. Why? Why is it that these curves are U-shaped? Whenever I am asked to like explain something like this of like, why does something change from one point to another? Segment your answer, meaning that talk about what happens prior to the intersection and then what happens after. So prior, the quantities prior to Q star, the ATC is higher than the marginal cost. And so therefore, the additional costs are bringing down the ATC curve, right? And so that's why the ATC is coming down. But then after Q star, the additional costs are greater than the average cost. And so that's making the average cost rise up. So I think that that's an easy way to break something down to explain it. Okay, so let's say here that the government places a per unit tax on this firm. Now, like, it's just so much easier to ask questions on the AP exam of like the tax is placed on the firm, because if you place it on the market, then you're kind of balancing things off and you're not going to be able to really explain stuff. So really recognize that in the questions that are asked. If you're asked a per unit versus a lump sum question, they're really placing it on the firm. Okay, so that's where then let's take a look at the difference between a per unit and a lump sum. And that's where we need to look at the different curves that are in here. So if I have my per unit tax and I have my lump sum tax, right? The different curves that I want to look at. Well, I want to get into my cost curves. So there's the fixed cost, the variable cost, and the total cost. And then we also have our marginal cost curve here. These are really the averages. So I could even throw those in because that's what I see there on it. The other curve that I'm dealing with is my marginal revenue. And the questions they can ask can be what happens to quantity, what happens to price, or what happens to deadweight loss. So let's ask what happens to quantity when they place a per unit tax. So in looking at things here, a per unit tax is a variable cost because it's dependent upon output. How much I have to pay depends upon how many units I am making. So if they're charging me $10 per unit, well, then that's my per unit tax. So my fixed costs, those will remain the same. My average variable costs will go up. My average total cost will go up. And then the big one here is my marginal cost. Remember that my marginal cost is equal to the change in variable cost. And there's so many people that go into this AP exam that don't recognize this relationship, and this will be will connect you with multiple answers to questions. So I think that this is a really important one. And so if my variable costs are going up, that means that my marginal costs are going up. So you could explain this two ways with the marginal cost. You could say the marginal cost shifts up, or you could say the marginal cost shifts to the left. I like shifts up just because it's U-shaped, and so I just feel like it's easier to say than saying shifts left. But either one works. So let's put those on the graph now. The only ones that I have drawn there are the ATC and the MC. So I've said here that my ATC is going to go up. And I've also said that my MC is going to go up. And so now what happens to my MR? Remember that a perfectly competitive firm is a price taker. They take the price from the industry, and there's nothing that's happening here in the industry to affect the equilibrium price. And so therefore, my marginal revenue is unchanged or remains the same. And so when I'm looking here at quantity, so how to describe this when I'm not drawing graphs for the AP exam? That's why I think it's good to chicken scratch it and use that in front of you, you know, like when you're answering something. But break this down. The first thing is that in order to find quantity, you need to look at where MR equals MC. Well, my MC went up, and so I would say my MC increases, my MR remains constant, and so therefore my quantity will decrease, right? So when I have that stuff there, then I'm able to show that and be able to properly explain it. That's why I think it helps to do that. Now, if we were talking here about a lump sum, if we're looking here at the lump sum, remember that a lump sum is everybody has to pay a particular amount. I don't care how much you make. I don't care if you make 1 unit or if you make 5,000 units. Everybody has to pay $100 of a lump sum tax to the government. And so therefore, my average fixed cost will go up. My average variable cost will not change because it's not dependent upon output. My ATC will go up. My marginal cost, which is dependent upon the change of variable costs, will not change. So therefore, my quantity remains the same because in looking at this here, my marginal cost will stay the same, my marginal revenue will stay the same. So therefore, my quantity will also remain the same. What really changes here would be the economic profit, right? Because economic profit, remember, is calculated price minus ATC times quantity. And so if I look here and if we were to just be a fixed cost one, so I'm getting rid of my marginal cost there, I'm still at the same quantity that I originally started with. And so it's price minus this higher ATC, because that still exists. And then that would be my economic loss. And so use your formulas to be able to explain what it is that you're describing. Segment things if you need to in order to show change. I think that's one of the best ways to do that. Are there any questions about lump sum versus per unit? This used to be like, for a while, I feel like I saw it a lot on the opening questions, on monopoly graphs, on perfectly competitive graphs, even externalities, which aren't on this. But this is definitely something that they want to know. Do you realize if quantity is going to change or not with regard to the lump sum and the per unit?
Do you think they would ask about economic profit and then like maybe have like letters that we like label the box of economic profit, or do you think that wouldn't even be a question?
I think that, Claire, like if you're going to shift something, I think it'd be hard to be able to do the letters. I think it would be explained. And so this is where I would say economic profit is calculated with price minus ATC, right? Price minus ATC times quantity is what gives me the economic profit. If I'm talking here about the per unit, my price didn't change, so that stayed the same. We had an ATC, right? And my ATC went up and my quantity went down. And so that's how I can show that there would be the economic loss. Okay. In the lump sum, my price wouldn't change, my quantity wouldn't change, but my ATC went up. And so that's how I can explain about the economic loss that way.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. I just think that when it comes to like showing the areas of things, I think it's going to be more about explaining, to be honest.
All right. That makes sense.
Like where you could use graphs to answer things would be about calculating. Like they could say like it goes up by $3, right? And then I could shift each of the curves along the $3, linear way to be able to calculate something. But that's where I would see things. Okay, so definitely be good here about lump sum versus per unit when we're thinking about that. So those to me are like some of the big things that go along with the cost curves and how they change. The last thing that does not get asked a lot, I've seen it only like once or twice on AP exams that have been released, and that is about the long run ATC. Now, the long run ATC can only happen in long run equilibrium. So this is where they have to tell you that the firm is in long run, or I'm a perfectly competitive firm and I'm breaking even, because then I know I'm in long run. But they could ask you about what is going on with regard to the ATC curve. And so that's where the last thing that I want to differentiate about cost curves would be the difference in the long run. The difference in the long run versus the short run. So when I talk here about the short run, Rahel, you were the one who hit it, and you said, you have diminishing returns with the marginal cost curve, and you have the increasing returns, and you have the diminishing returns. Okay, that's what we're looking at with it. The long run, when I think about cost curves, is I think about the long run ATC, right? And remember that there's 3 stages to the long run ATC. There is the economies of scale, and with the economies of scale, this is where I'm changing long run, multiple variable inputs. Firms can enter and exit. You can have more people, you can have more capital, you can have all of these things happening at the same time. But this is the economies of scale. And then you have it where you have the constant returns to scale. And then we also have the diseconomies of scale. That's bad news, right? No firm should ever operate in diseconomies of scale. This is where you have just the too many times the same job is being repeated by too many people, because the company's so big, they're not able to organize it. So if I'm looking here at different long run scenarios, think about then what is happening with regard to the long run ATC. So if I am here, and this is just abbreviated, but if I am here with the perfectly competitive, right, and I'm in long run equilibrium, what am I say is happening? Well, I am at constant returns to scale, right? Because I'm hitting there at the minimum ATC. We don't, in class, we haven't been labeling this like long run ATC because I feel like it's so hard, but this is what it is, right? When we're looking at it. If I were to draw here let's draw a monopoly in long run, right? We've got our demand, we've got our marginal revenue. There's my quantity and my price. Let's allow them to have their economic profit. What is happening this is long run. What is happening in the long run to the ATC curve for this monopoly? And how can I explain that? Well, if I look here at it, the firm is operating right here on the downward part of the ATC curve. And so they would be having economies of scale because they're to the left of the minimum long run ATC, which is right here. So again, segment things when you're doing it, but just remember that this is the way of describing the long run cost curve for the ATC. I've just seen that a couple times, but I just wanted to point that out. Okay. All right. So then that takes us to our different types of competitive structures. We have perfectly competitive, monopolistically competitive, oligopolies, and monopolies. When I'm thinking about PC, obviously, a lot of questions can be asked about the PC, and you're not going to be required to draw it, but we've got to be able to analyze it. So when we think here about the perfectly competitive, remember that it's always shown as the side by side. You've got your demand and supply for the market. We've got our equilibrium, price and quantity. Why am I doing the dotted line? Claire, do you remember why we do the dotted line?
No.
Rahil, do you know why I did the dotted line?
Price taker.
Very good. So the firm is a price taker. They take the price from the industry. Why? The reason why is twofold. One, there are so many firms in this industry that one firm cannot manipulate the price. The second reason is that these firms, that there's so many of them, are selling an identical product. And so therefore, they're not able to have control over making the price. So when I'm looking at this here, this is where I have my Mr. DARP. I'm just going to do right now marginal revenue equals demand, because I'm going to put the price of the firm here when I'm making that. And then this would be my firm. So in looking at this here, I've got my marginal cost curve. That is my U-shaped. And so now I'm going to show it with my ATC up here. Right? So what you need to do when you're thinking about the perfectly competitive is you need to be able to put in the quantities that go along with this, the price, and then also if they were to ask like how things change with regard to the long run. And so when I'm looking at this here, I'm also going to put in my AVC. Now look at where I placed my AVC. My AVC, I'm placing here, which is below the price. And the reason that I need to make sure it's there, so one of the things that they could give you is data. They could show you a graph. And they could say, what is needed in order for this firm to operate in the short run? And what's needed in order for the firm to operate in the short run is for price to be greater than the average variable cost. Because if they can't cover their variable costs, then not only are they losing their fixed costs, but they're losing some of the variable costs. If they shut down and produce nothing, which they're not going out of business, it just means, okay, I'm shutting down at 6 instead of 8, then when they shut down, then they're only losing their fixed costs because they don't have to pay for those workers. They don't have to pay for the electricity and raw materials that are being used. And so this is one thing that I'm looking at in order for a firm, to decide about a firm. That can be a really easy question to ask, right? About like how should this firm operate or not. So this is one of our formulas that we need to know about operating. So then the other thing that they can talk about are changes that happen to the variable or the fixed costs, which, to be honest with you, is what we just talked about with a lump sum and a per unit tax and like what things would shift. So I feel like it's now just talking about input prices instead of a tax, but same look on the graph and same things that would change. Then they could talk about, well, what is happening with regard to economic profit or loss based on this scenario. And so obviously they have an economic loss, and that is because the price, I would explain it, at the profit maximizing output of MR equals MC, the price is less than the average total cost. And so therefore, an economic loss is created. This is where, like Claire, if they had numbers and stuff, they could have you calculate it. They could have me calculate total cost, which wouldn't just be the price per unit here. It would be if this, let's say here is 15 and the quantity over here is 20, well, then I could have a total cost of 300. And so that's where you want to make sure you understand if they're asking you to calculate average cost or total cost when you're doing things here. Okay, so those are like short run type questions. Then we get into the long run. And with the long run here, this would be a question about what happens to firms in the long run. Well, in the long run, firms either enter or exit. And the question is why? The reason why firms can enter or exit in a perfectly competitive firm in the long run is because of the ease of entry and exit. There aren't significant barriers to entry. You don't have patents. You don't have to advertise. None of that. When I'm selling my broccoli on the street, I just pick it up and I go. You know, it's either I'm doing it or I'm not. And so in this case here, firms would exit the industry. And so they might ask me, well, what happens to market equilibrium and price? If there's anything that I can say about when you take the AP exam for micro, and I don't care if it's this year where it's different, a little different in what they're doing versus other years, you look at the question and see, are they asking me a market question or are they asking me a firm question? So in this case here, I'm asking you about the market. What happens to market equilibrium, price, and quantity? Well, you would have an increase in the price because the supply curve would shift to the left because firms would exit the industry. I gave my determinant, number of suppliers, right? And that would cause an increase in the price and it would cause a decrease in the quantity. What we know is that this will happen, this change, up until the point, I'm going to get rid of my economic loss here. This will happen up until the point where the equilibrium price, that was horrible. The equilibrium price is tangent to minimum ATC because this is what represents long run equilibrium, is that trifecta, right? I have allocative efficiency, marginal cost equals price, or you could say marginal cost equals demand. I have productive efficiency, where marginal cost equals the average total cost. And I also have it where they break even because my price equals ATC. And so if I can hang in there and firms exit this industry, the quantity in the firm will actually go up. So if I wanted to make it all look perfect, I would have a supply 2 that would be there, right? And that would give me that P2. So those are ways that they can ask about the perfectly competitive firm in the short run versus the long run. Few questions.
Can perfectly competitive firms break even in the short run, or are they always making a profit or a loss?
They're always making an economic profit or suffering an economic loss. That's like what defines what short run is. And what defines long run is the fact that they break even. So you cannot break even in the short run. And you can't enter and exit in the short run because the short run, you can only change one variable input. And you can't enter and exit in changing that because that changes like everything, right? And so that's where you have the different things with the perfectly competitive firm. Does that sound good? Then, okay, so keywords about perfectly competitive. They have identical products or homogeneous products. They're price takers. They take the price from the industry. They have the ease of entry and exit. And they are always allocatively efficient. You know, they're the only ones that achieve that allocative efficiency. So then we can say, okay, well, that's perfect competition. Now you have monopolistic competition. The thing about monopolistic competition, I don't feel like it gets asked a lot, to be honest with you. But some things that I have seen that I think are really interesting for us to take note of is that first off, if they were to tell me that this is a market that has similar but not identical products or differentiated products with an ease of entry and exit, I'm talking monopolistic competition. That's how I know. And if they were to tell me that and say, what type of competition is this? Or what type of firm is this? You have to say monopolistic competition. I have seen things where if it just says monopolistic, you know, that doesn't count. You have to say monopolistic competition, when you are describing this type of competition. So the thing about monopolistic competition is that now they're all going to start to look the same. You have your demand, which equals your average revenue, which equals your price. You have your marginal revenue, which is less than your demand curve. You have your marginal cost curve that is upward sloping. Rahil, we're in the short run, so that means we either have to have an economic profit or a loss. And so therefore, I'm going to have them have an economic profit this time. And so my ATC curve is below the demand curve. Make this just a little more below, right? Because I go where MR equals MC, I take it up to the demand curve, and that gives me the price of the monopolistically competitive. It gives me the quantity of the monopolistically competitive. So things that they would ask about monopolistic competition. One, what happens in the long run? In the long run, you still have ease of entry and exit. And so therefore, firms in this case would enter into the market. They're not going to make you draw it. Maybe they'll make you explain it. So what happens here is that there would be an increase in the supply of firms, right? When firms enter into this industry, then what that means is that there's more places for me to shop. And so this guy's going to still be there, but this is going to cause a decrease in the demand for this monopoly or monopolistically competitive firm. And if there's a decrease in the demand for this firm, that means that there's also a decrease in the marginal revenue because these two, remember, travel together. And so they're both going to shift to the left. They're not going to make you draw that or anything. If anything, they're just going to ask you what happens. And so therefore, if there is a decrease in the demand in the marginal revenue, well, then what you know is that this MR is going to be over here. And so that's going to cause a decrease in the quantity, right? Because now MR equals MC over here. And then you're also going to have it where it's going to be a higher price because I'm at a lower quantity. And the law of demand tells us as quantity goes down, the price goes up. And so therefore, I would have a higher price that would be happening. So this is what you would find if there was economic profit. This is what would happen in the long run. It would happen up until the point that the firm breaks even. And so in the end, you would have it where the price equals average total cost. The long run graph for the monopolistically competitive in long run equilibrium looks like this. Oh. Right? And this is where, remember that ATC is going to ride like that. And so then I'll have my price here. And so that's what it would show, because remember, price equals ATC. I have to have it right along it, right? Because minimum ATC is the intersection of the marginal cost and the average total cost curve. Which then leads us to like the last thing, and that is excess capacity. Why does this firm show excess capacity? Excess capacity is when you are not producing at the quantity of productive efficiency. A monopolistically competitive firm will never be productively efficient, and therefore they will always have excess capacity because their ATC will be higher because they'll always produce to the left of minimum ATC. Their ATC will be higher than minimum ATC. So those are the kind of keywords or buzzwords that I think about with monopolistic competition. Any questions about monopolistic competition?
What's the difference in the graph between this and the monopoly?
Okay, visually, nothing. If I were to have to explain it, it would be that the demand curve is more elastic. Why? In a monopolistically competitive. Why? Because there's more substitutes, there's more choices available. But otherwise, stock graph wise, they all look the same. But technically, the demand curve is more elastic. Okay. Then that takes us to the oligopoly. When I think about an oligopoly, I think that there's like a lot of like little keywords that they can use in order to describe an oligopoly. So for example, there's price leadership. Or there's an interdependency between the firms. And that is because when one firm raises its price, another firm travels along with it, you know, and they follow each other when they're doing that. Remember that there are around 3 to 4 firms that dominate the industry. That's what makes them an oligopoly. They can collude, which then would make them like a monopoly. But when you have the price leadership, that's what gives us that whole game theory. Do you guys remember game theory when we were talking about that? With game theory, usually they show you a duopoly, which is where you have 2 firms. And in those 2 firms, you have that payoff matrix. And they could have these firms doing so many different things. They could operate and shut down. They could price high, price low. They could advertise, not advertise. You know, it can be all kinds of different things that they have when they are doing this. So let's say here that I have them advertise and not advertise. Right, and they both are making these same choices, right? When we're looking at it. Now, what I'm looking at in here, unless it's the prisoner's dilemma, where it's like a cost of like what's happening, it's usually the payoff matrix. So it's like, how much money am I making if I do this? So I was doing this earlier. Let's see if I can remember some of the things that were shown here. I feel like. So you're not looking at this in the packet, are you?
No, I can find it though.
Is it? Are you in unit? Do you have unit 3 in front of you? No, unit 4.
No.
Yes.
No, I don't.
All right, I'm going to make up numbers. We'll hope that this works. Okay. So with this here, let's say that we have 110 and we have no. I'm going to do 110 and we have 50. I'll do 50 and 110 here, and then this one would be like 100 and 100. Okay, 2 things I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about this. First one is Nash Equilibrium. The second one is dominant strategy. Remember that a dominant strategy is where I don't care what the other person does, I'm always going to do the same thing. And so if I look here at this, and let's say that this is firm B, and this is firm A, right? And if I look at this and trying to figure out their dominant, if they have a dominant strategy or not, I got to go through and remember, do the X's in the box. So for firm A, if they choose to advertise, then is it better for firm B to advertise or not advertise? Well, obviously having, and firm B's are always the numbers to the left, having a payoff of 100 is better than 50. So firm B is going to advertise. If firm A doesn't advertise, is it better for firm B to advertise or to not advertise? And in this case here, it would be better for them to not advertise. And so that is where we would have the X there, right? Because, no, 50 over 80. Firm B, okay, yeah, that's right. Okay, so firm B should not advertise. Firm B, if they advertise, is it better for firm A to advertise or not advertise? And it's better for them to advertise. If firm B doesn't advertise, is it better for firm A to advertise or not advertise? And it's better for them to advertise. So, dominant strategy. Firm A has a dominant strategy because I don't care what firm B does, they're always going to advertise. Firm B does not have a dominant strategy. When we talk about Nash Equilibrium, you got to be able to put this in your own words this year, maybe, of what Nash Equilibrium is. And so based upon when you know what the payoff matrix, what the payoffs are, you're looking for the best payoff because you don't know what the other person is going to do. And that's how you're deciding where you're making your choices. And the Nash equilibrium is an equilibrium where both are doing the same thing. And so in this case here, our Nash equilibrium is to both advertise. On last year's exam, they had a Nash equilibrii, which truly I had never taught before, but you actually had two Nash equilibriums. Students did fine with it because they did the X's in the box and there were two that played out. And I think that's just important to remember when you're looking at these things, is that they're going to try to throw you off and not just give you the easiest problems. So go with how you would normally answer something and apply it to the situation that you see, right? Because that's important when we're talking about that. Okay. And so that's what I'd be thinking about here with game theory. The last thing that they could do is they could say, okay, so what happens now is that there is an extra $50 charge for firms that advertise. As a result, what is the payoff matrix, or what is the Nash equilibrium? Does it stay the same or does it change? And that's where then you'd have to subtract out 50 from every place where somebody is advertising. So it would be 50 out of here, 50 out of here. This here is the advertising, right? And so there you would have it with it. And then over here, they're advertising. And so you would have this one too. So that's where you'd have to subtract the 50 out. So students sometimes have trouble with that. But that's another way they kind of create these problems for Nash equilibrium.
Can you explain that again, please?
What I just did?
Yeah.
Okay. So if they charge $50, say the government, or there's just this new production cost or something for advertising, then what I have to look at with my payoff matrix is that, okay, based on this new scenario, in this box here, both people are advertising. And so no longer are their payoffs each going to be 100. Now it's going to be a payoff of 50 because it cost me $50 to advertise. And this one's going to be 50, right? And then in this one here, firm B is not advertising, but firm A is advertising. And so this payoff here would be 60. And then the same is true for this one. Firm A is not advertising, but firm B is advertising. And so this would become a 60. And then based off of that, Rahil, you just would go through again and do the X's to see who has see what the Nash equilibrium is.
So you only do that when they tell you the
Yeah.
cost of this is $50 or something?
Yeah, otherwise they've already given you the payouts from it. So it's usually like the last question on a payoff matrix question. It's like the new scenario to see if you can follow that. Okay.
Wait, now I'm confused because then if firm A advertises, it doesn't matter what firm B does because they're both 50, right?
Well, no, that's just, it does matter because I've got to look and see. So, well, let's look and see what our things are. You know what I mean? So now I'd have to go through and do all of this again. So if firm A advertises, right? Then for firm B, this one here, oh yeah, I guess it doesn't. So is that what you're saying here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I could do either, right? Advertise or not. And so that's where maybe they could throw a little wrench in it, and be like, well, they choose both. So I think I would put it an X for both. You know what I mean? Because either one would work for me in order to. And then that could be a new way of opening things up to find equilibriums.
All right.
Okay. So just go with the X's in the box, and then you'd be able to see that stuff. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So then that leads us to the last thing, which is the monopolies. And with the monopolies here, the thing about a monopoly is, okay, a colluding monopoly is a colluding oligopoly is a monopoly. Monopolies and oligopolies in the long run always earn economic profit. Remember, I've always said, like, I'm laughing at you if you're a monopoly and you don't earn economic profit, even in the short run. But newsflash, like, I think it was the last AP exam, they had it where a monopoly was suffering a loss, you know? So people like wrote on their AP exam, like, I'm laughing at you because you're suffering a loss. But with a monopoly, where you have things, that's where I've seen like the lump sum and the per unit tax being put on there. But also you have the discriminating monopoly, you know, like different ways to differentiate about what monopolies are about. So a normal monopoly graph, I'm going to draw that over here. A normal monopoly graph would have your demand and your marginal revenue. Ooh, and let's go to one of the questions that we talked about a lot this year. Why is it that there is market failure with a monopoly? And I could ask this question about a monopoly, an oligopoly, or monopolistically competitive. Well, the first thing that you want to do is you want to think about what is market failure. And not having market failure would be allocative efficiency, all right? So when you're not at allocative efficiency, that is market failure. And that's where either price doesn't equal marginal cost or demand doesn't equal marginal, right? Yeah, marginal cost. And or demand doesn't equal marginal cost. So this right here is our allocatively efficient point, right? They're producing where MR equals MC. This is where this monopoly, or really any imperfectly competitive firm, is. But the question I asked you is, why is there market failure? Not what is market failure. The reason that there is market failure is because the marginal revenue curve is less than the demand curve. And so therefore, you will always profit maximizing be producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. You take that up to the demand curve, and that gives you the equilibrium price. That is never going to be at the allocatively efficient point. So market failure exists because the demand curve is greater than the marginal revenue curve. Please, on the AP exam, look and see, are they asking me a cause question, which would be demand is greater than marginal revenue, or an effect question, which is price isn't equaling marginal cost? I think that's really important when we're talking about what they're looking for in the answer. Because you might know it, you know, or like know that they're not at the socially optimal, but, you know, we're not seeing that. So you have your discriminating monopoly. Remember with the discriminating monopoly, so I'm going to write that up there. This is where you have it where they are selling products to people and people are buying it all at different prices. They're buying it based upon their willingness and ability to be able to do that. And so my demand is going to equal my marginal revenue, which is going to equal my price. I'm not having a marginal revenue curve that's less than it, because let's say I sold the first unit for $20 to somebody. I sold the next quantity, that's quantity, the second person that I sold it to them for 18. And then let's say the third person, I sold it to them for 15, right? And let's say that the fourth person, I sold it to them at 10, which is where my marginal cost equals my ATC, right? So a few things. If I'm going to compare a pure monopoly to a discriminating monopoly, a few things I can compare. First off, when we talk about quantity that is sold, you will always produce more when you are a discriminating monopoly than you will with a pure monopoly. Your economic profit will always be greater the more that you can discriminate than you will with a pure monopoly. How you calculate economic profit is different. We said here, price minus ATC times quantity. For economic profit here, I have to use total revenue minus total cost. I've got 4 units that are sold here. My total revenue is 20 plus 18. Remember to show your work on the AP exam. My total cost, 4 units that were sold at $10. That would give me my economic profit. Okay. And so you can see things with that one. But the other good one to ask you about is consumer surplus. If I look here and I'm looking at the consumer surplus of this firm, there is a discriminating monopoly. There is no consumer surplus. They're selling the price at exactly what people are willing and able to buy it. And so for a discriminating monopoly, consumer surplus is always going to be equal to 0. For the for the pure monopoly, the consumer surplus, this is the price that they're charging it at. The consumer surplus, if I make this demand curve like that, this is going to be the consumer surplus. Below the demand curve and above the equilibrium price, that's going to be the consumer surplus for the monopoly. So those are big things that go on with the discriminating. And notice they're allocatively efficient if they, are selling all of them. They even are productively efficient if they sell all of them. And so you have those different things when you're looking at the graph as to how things fall. Now, we did talk about also you can segment the market, remember? So here's questions they could ask. How do you discriminate in a monopoly? 2 things have to happen. 1, I can segment the market. I can figure out how to divide things up amongst people. It can be perfectly discriminating. It could be the segmented, like we talked about train tickets and how I'm in the higher price group because I don't have a student ID and you guys are in the lower price group. And so you have a student ID. And so when we look at the graph for that and what that looks like, that's just a matter now where you have your demand equaling your marginal revenue. And that's where you have the price to me, which is high. The price to you, this is the group of people that get the lower price. And then this is the consumer surplus that you would have. So there is some consumer surplus with that. I mean, this is the way to go if you're going to sell something, is to discriminate as much as you can. You have to be able to segment the market, and people can't resell the product. You're selling it as the final good. Those are the 2 criteria in order to make a discriminating monopoly work for either one. Okay. The last thing that I have about monopolies would be a natural monopoly. And so with the natural monopoly, remember for this one here, for the natural monopoly, they have very high economies of scale, meaning as you increase quantity, your ATC or your cost per unit are continually dropping. And when you're looking at it, remember, it's just to the point where it's continually dropping and it's never hitting that marginal cost curve. And eventually it will. And then that's where you could have the ATC ride up. But this is where you have your demand curve and your marginal revenue curve and giving you the quantities for that, right? Things they ask about a natural monopoly. You got 2 choices of how to regulate a natural monopoly. It doesn't make sense to have a lot of producers. A lot of producers would produce where MR equals MC. The price would be super high, and all of them would be having a little quantity because of those high startup costs. So instead, we can regulate the market in 2 ways. 1, we could regulate based upon the socially optimal. So this is where your price equals marginal cost, or your demand equals your marginal cost. But the trade-off with this is that I cannot cover my costs. And as a result, the government would have to subsidize this firm. The other way that you could do it, so that is the socially optimal. And the trade-off is that they have to be subsidized. The other way that you could do it is you could do the fair return. And with the fair return, this is where price equals ATC. And so if I'm looking here at my ATC curve and looking at my price, this is where would be the fair return. This is where is the socially optimal. So the trade-off is that you are not at allocative efficiency. So remember we talked about like electricity. That might mean then from like 7 to 8 at night, you have to turn off your electricity. And then somebody else has to do it from 9 to 10 because not everybody can have it at all of the times that they want. So you got to know the trade-offs. You've got to know where they're producing at. You've got to know economies of scale because that's what creates it. The last thing that I feel like goes into this unit is deadweight loss. Deadweight loss, you guys, is everywhere, right? We have deadweight loss on the market and on the firm side. So first off, deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is the loss of consumer and producer surplus. And so when the government gets involved. And so when you look here at the deadweight loss, if I am in equilibrium for the market with demand and supply, there is no deadweight loss. I am producing at the allocatively efficient amount of supply equals demand on the market side, right? Where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. That's what the supply curve is, and that's what the demand curve is. That gives me allocative efficiency, right? Perfectly competitive firm, they are always allocatively efficient. They always have it where demand and price equal marginal cost, right? Because that's where they always produce at. Why? Because they're price takers. They have no control over the market, and so therefore they have to take the price from the industry. Their price equals their marginal revenue, and they always produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And so a PC firm is always allocatively efficient, and you can either say it because of that, or you can say it because of that. And the reason why is because my marginal revenue equals my demand.
Why can't a perfectly competitive firm set their price lower than the market?
Because, so you're one firm in the industry. I can literally walk to the next block to buy broccoli that you're selling. And so therefore, if you change your price and make it higher, then you will lose all of your quantity will go to zero because people will be able to easily replace you. Because you sell identical products. You have no control over the industry. Okay? Now, for an imperfectly competitive firm, there is clearly deadweight loss, right? So when I get an imperfectly competitive firm, they produce, demand does not equal marginal revenue. They produce where MR equals MC, right? You take it up to the demand curve, and that gives you the price. Allocative efficiency is where demand equals marginal cost or price equals marginal cost. And so therefore, this is the socially optimal output, and they are far less than this. Why? Because their marginal revenue is less than their demand. Remember, it's that triangle that you get, you know, like when we're talking about deadweight loss, we're talking, it's based upon quantity and not being at the allocatively efficient amount. It's the loss of consumer and producer surplus that goes along with it. So like an easy way to show it here, the government sets in a tax. As a result now, we have a quantity that is being sold here. We have a price that is being charged there. When we look at this and see the change that is going to happen, this is the amount, remember, that the supplier gets. And so when we look at the revenue that goes to the government, this whole box here is government revenue. This up here is consumer surplus. This down here is producer surplus, but this triangle right here, nobody is getting. Like nobody receives this. It doesn't go to the government, it doesn't go to the consumer, and it doesn't go to the producer. And so there's deadweight loss. I'm not at the allocatively efficient point, and it's the loss of the consumer and producer surplus. That's how I'm explaining deadweight loss.
When is deadweight loss on the other side?
What side?
Like to the other side of the demand curve.
For this one?
Like is it I remember seeing some problems or graphs in which the deadweight loss is on the right side of the demand curve going up.
Rahel, that was with externalities.
Oh, okay.
And so that was where you were going with the original, right? And then you take it to the new curve, and then that would show you your deadweight loss. And I'm not including that on here simply because externalities, sadly, are not on the AP exam.
Okay.
But otherwise, when I'm looking at things, I mean, this here, though, well, no, because it's still, you're looking at it this way with the deadweight loss. It's still going to be about this quantity here, because it's the loss of the producer and consumer surplus that you would normally find with the perfectly competitive. So I really feel like that just goes with our externalities.
That graph on the bottom of the imperfectly competitive, does that does an oligopoly, does that include oligopolies? Do they have marginal revenue that's less than demand?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Anything that's an imperfectly competitive firm, so they're a price maker, they do not have identical products. The only one that has an identical product is the perfectly competitive. And have an unlimited amount of producers.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Very good questions. Okay, I feel like this really covers units 3 and 4, right? And getting in that perfect competition and the imperfect competition. I feel like we've hit a lot of the things like with the cost curves and ways to shift them, because that's what they're going to look at is how do you do with change. I feel like that was something that we've also covered. Do you have any final questions?
Yeah, can you go over once more why the ATC is at its minimum when it intersects the marginal cost curve?
Yeah, okay. And I think, like Rahel, it's a really good one to ask on the AP exam if I got to explain, okay? So I've got my marginal cost curve. I've got my ATC, right? And this is where I say, when you have to do these things, segment the market. Segment it and say what happens here versus what happens here, okay? So at this quantity here of productive efficiency, which is minimum ATC, I have a marginal cost curve that is less than my ATC. And so all of the additional costs are lower than the average costs. And so they're bringing the average down. Like I used the example before, like about grades, right? And a class would be the marginal cost, and your cumulative GPA would be the average cost. And if you get less of an average in one class versus what your cumulative is, it's going to bring your cumulative down, right? And so that's what's happening here, is that the additional cost from the next unit is less than the average, and so it's bringing the average down. But everything after this point, the additional cost per unit is greater than the average cost. And so it's going to make the average rise. Where it intersects, they're equal to one another. So it's kind of that positioning point with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? That'd be like, too, if I had to segment about why MR equals MC is the profit maximizing output. You know, segment the market. This will be the last thing, okay? So where MR equals MC is our profit maximizing output. Why? Because everything prior to this unit, the additional revenue is greater than the additional cost. And so therefore, I'm adding to my total profit. And so my total profit keeps going up when I'm on this side of it, because my additional revenue per unit is greater than my additional cost. So I keep adding to my total profit all the way until I get to Q1. Because after Q1, the additional cost per unit is greater than the additional revenue. And so therefore, I start to subtract from my total profit. It doesn't mean that my total profit is negative. It just means now my total profit is starting to go down. So these are the types of things I feel like they could be doing, of asking us, like, to explain and to be able to do that. And so that's where I think it's important to understand the why.
When MC is under MR, isn't that a good thing?
It's a good thing, but it's not the best thing. It means that I'm adding like 5, like let's say the marginal revenue is 10, and over here the marginal revenue is 5, or the marginal cost is 5. That means at this quantity here of 2, I'm adding $5 to my total profit. But if I go here and I make this at quantity 3, and now my revenue is 10 and my marginal cost is 7, well, I just added another $3. So like, okay, great, I made 5, but now I've made 8. I definitely would take $8 over $5. Would you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then this one here, it's 0. And so that's why you want to produce the max amount. And now I'll start to chip away at my $8 as I go to quantity 5. Okay. Okay, I hope that you found this helpful. The next one that we're meeting on is on unit 5, which is our last one, and that's on the labor market. And I kind of feel like we need some help on that one. So, so that'll be our last one. Otherwise, we've been hitting all of these. Please do not hesitate to ask me any questions that you have or anything. I so appreciate that you guys came to this, and I hope that I was able to help you personally with the questions that you have. Okay?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having this.
No problem. It's good to see you guys.
Thanks. Bye.
I'll see you later. Bye.